For those of you who don't know me, my name is Susan Futterman. In order to hear about a project from my Synagogue Social Action Committee that they were sponsoring. After speaking to Pam a while, she recruited me to work in the office assisting Marilyn Tallman, the chair. Pam became president of the Union of Councils for Soviet Jewry, where she led a national effort to free Soviet Jews. The story of her experiences is documented in her new book, Hidden Heroes. Natan Sharansky's daughter recently reviewed Pam's book for JewishPress.com. Rachel Sharansky Danziger said, quote, Hidden Heroes maps the realities of the joint struggle of American activists and refuseniks that wove international diplomacy and private lives. Family crises intertwine with crises in Moscow. Comrades in arms become friends and vice versa. In one memorable scene in the book, an urgent call from Moscow requires Pam's immediate mobilization, hours before Rosh Hashanah. Pam leaves her pots to simmer on the fire to throw herself into a flurry of phone calls. The simmering pots are mentioned as an aside, a dash of color. To me, however, they represent the secret reason for Pam's success. The struggle for Soviet Jewry succeeded because people like Pamela Braun-Cohen cared enough to bring the cause into the intimate fabric of their homes and lives. At the same time, they cared enough to set aside their own interests and pots when the struggle called for it, and they did it many times over many years, unquote. As the overt struggle for Soviet Jewry was winding down, Pam decided it was time to study Torah and discover what the Soviet Jews were willing to risk their lives for. Pam found a rabbi who was willing to teach students without much background and proceeded to find other students to join her. That organization, Komamayas, later brought Rabbi David and Ali to Chicago. Rabbi David calls Pam the grandmother of L'Chaim Center. Ali Vegan once used the word visionary to describe Pam. I never forgot that. Pam began advocating for Soviet Jews when there were not a lot of people doing it. Pam began an outreach tour organization when there weren't a lot of people doing it. Many people see needs but don't act upon them. Pam sees the need and acts. Pam has given me two opportunities that have profoundly shaped my life. She asked me to work at Chicago Action, where I was able to orchestrate mitzvot for Jews in the former Soviet Union for 20 years. And she invited me to study Torah, which began my preoccupation with Torah study for the last 30 years. I'm very pleased and very proud to introduce my mentor and dear friend, Pam Cohen.
Susie, and thank you, Larry and Susie, for inviting me, and thank you all for coming, and thank you for being a part of the L'Chaim Center. And it's so important what you're doing, you're learning, and to continue to do that because it impacts our future, and we're all counting on that. Yeah, I wrote the book. But first, I want to say that this book is not about me. I wrote the book. I was, in a sense, an eyewitness and a messenger and a participant, and witnessed many, many hidden heroes that impacted Jewish history. And many of them are unknown. And Susie, and I want to tell you this, Susie Futterman is one of them. I remember very clearly especially after the Soviet Union, when I can tell you dozens and dozens of small towns, Jews in small towns, had lost the whole infrastructure of the Soviet Union, had fallen apart. And they wanted to know who they were. Jews wanted to know their own identity. They had no books, they had nothing. And Susie was on the phone. Thank you so much. Susie was on the phone with Natasha Stonov, translating, getting all the information, and then finding synagogues to hook up to provide all the needs in those towns. So when I talk about hidden heroes, she's one of them. Well, other hidden heroes union in the dark years when we needed them to go and be like shlichim to bring information in and permission out. How many of you were among those people that went? So you're also among the hidden heroes of this movement, because without you, this movement could not have existed. But I know there are young people here, and I know that many people still do not know the names of people like Natan Sharansky or Yosef Mendeleevich, who are our national heroes. And in fact, many young people today don't probably even know what the Soviet Union was. Today it's Russia and Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Crimea. But 30 years ago, that empire collapsed. And I want to talk to you about what the Soviet Union was. I want you to kind of close your eyes and imagine what the Soviet Union was. You all know what Korea is today. You know how closed how closed the society is. I want you to picture a country today, a continent of 11 time zones. 11 time zones with a border that was absolutely secure, that not one leaf could pass through without KGB noticing it and without border guards. It was the workers' paradise with over 1 million KGB informants that were trained to inform any deviant behavior, any behavior that deviated from the social and but it wasn't just the political world. It was what the school wanted you to know. It was what your professors wanted you to know. And there was no deviation and no dissidence, because there was also no freedom of speech. There was no right to assemble. There was no contact with organizations abroad. And in those 11 time zones, there were what we thought then were between 3 and 5 million Jews. Later, we learned that it was many more than that. But in those 11 time zones that stretched from Vladivostok, which overlooks Japan, all the way to the borders of Europe, it was a sealed, solid, government, state-controlled country with absolutely no freedom. For Jews, the situation was even worse. Starting with the socialists and then the Bolsheviks and the 1917 revolution, and then Stalin, the governments systematically wiped out all vestiges of anything Jewish. Now, we today take it for granted that we can get a Jewish newspaper, or we can get a Jewish magazine, or we can go to the L'chaim Center, or we can talk to a rabbi, or we can check something on the internet. There was no internet, and there were no rabbis, and there was no right to assemble, and there was no books, no magazines, nothing written, and anything that you might have had in your house that your grandfather might have had, or in your case, your great-great-grandfather might have had a siddur, it was written in a language which was considered anti-Soviet, because Israel was considered an anti-Soviet country. And to tell you the truth, of 3 to 5 million Jews that were there and were isolated in a culturally Judenized world, didn't know much about Israel. I mean, it's hard to us. I mean, it's almost inconceivable. I mean, it's 30 years later. Many of us lived through it and knew this, but it's almost impossible to imagine a time when a Jew did not know that there was a country that was their Jewish homeland and that did not know the history or the ties with Jews. But they didn't, because the Soviets had very, very effectively purged all information. Now, not only was it Judenrein in terms of Jewish culture and religion, it was a fiercely anti-Semitic country. And I want you to hear this because it rings true to me, even though I will say things today that may seem politically incorrect. I am by nature and by have learned from dissidents, so I am a dissident. Today, we have anti-Semitism that masquerades as anti-Zionism. Nobody is anti-Semitic. We're just anti-Israel. We're just anti-Zionists. It was exactly what the Kremlin said. Anti-Semitism was illegal according to the Soviet Constitution under the Kremlin, but it could masquerade as anti-Zionism. And anything in Hebrew was considered a subversive language, and you could go to prison for having it. Now, how are children raised? Children were raised in most cases in Russia, in the 50s, under Stalin especially, and even a little bit after that under Khrushchev, children were raised shut still. Be quiet. There were separate exams for Jews. It's been documented, and you'll read about it in the book. And Judith Bialy, who actually did the research and had a press conference of Refusnik, and you'll read about it in Hidden Heroes. Especially in math, they admitted Jews and Chechens had separate entrance exams. And Jews, no matter how brilliant they were, could not be accepted to the finest schools. So the parents told their kids, be quiet, don't make waves, don't do anything that would be considered anti-Soviet, just study. I have friends, my friends from today that are in Jerusalem. Parents hired physicists and mathematic professors to teach their children so that they could be the best in the class. And I have to tell you an aside, I'm talking to so many people that are friends. I had a doctor come to our house for a Shabbos dinner once. Walked over with his wife. We live in the city, and he was from Russia. And he told us a story which just is so apropos. When he was going to school, his father would stand there at the door waiting for him to come in. Knew what was your grade? The kid said an 8 every day. An 8. Father was happy. One day the kid comes in, walks into the house. He says, kid is terrified. What was your grade? The boy says, I got a B. And the father said, a B? He said, do you understand? You're an embarrassment to the family, to the Jewish people. I mean, that was growing up in Russia. You had to be better than anybody else. Now, what made a difference was the 1967 war in Israel. It was literally like a lightning bolt piercing the blackness of Russia and the Soviet Union. Soviets put in the 6-Day War, the Soviet anti-Semitic state media showed films of soldiers, Israeli soldiers in uniforms, fleeing the battles, saying that they were cowards, that they had abandoned the war, that they were leaving, and that Israel had lost the war, and that they were just what they thought that they were. That look at these Jews, they're cowards, they can't even fight for their own country. But Jews, even though as assimilated and as socially conventional as they were politically, they could read between the lines. And what they saw in this anti-Semitic media were soldiers, Jewish soldiers fighting for a homeland that for the first time they understood was theirs. We have a homeland. We have a people. We are a nation. And every single Jew who watched those anti-Semitic programs, and I've talked to many of them, walked out of their houses 3 inches taller the next day. They felt a sense of dignity, and they decided that why should we be living here where we are not wanted and we cannot be who we are, and we don't even know who we are. We're what we called Homo Sovieticus, a Soviet man. It was a new genus of humanity that was being built by Stalin. We don't even know what it means to be a Jew, but we're going, if this is our homeland, we're going. But there was no immigration. We weren't allowed to immigrate. Nevertheless, in Leningrad, especially, and in Riga, especially Latvia, numbers of Jews started to apply to Israel, and they were refused permission. Now, they were refused permission in 1967, and they have to apply every 6 months. And later, I don't let me forget, I want to be able to tell you what this process of immigration was like for them. Every 6 months they had to apply, and every 6 months they were rejected and refused because of they had either someone said pretext, state secrecy, or whatever reasons they were not allowed to leave. And a group of them from Leningrad and Riga. And this is our history. And this is something that every Jew in America should know. And every young person should know this story. A group of Jews decided that only if we in the West, if only Jews in the West would know their story, if only Jews in the West could help them, if only Jews would know that they were trying to leave, there would be hope. And so they decided to do something that would send up like a flare in the night. And they decided to do something that they knew that would give them the death sentence. They decided, it's Mesiras Nefesh, selflessness. They decided to try to take an airplane from Leningrad to Sweden in a secret operation, all spy stuff called Operation Wedding. And a group of them, there were 16 of them at the end, went to Leningrad quietly. Of course, there were leaks, there were KGB leaks. KGB, the secret police, knew everything, and they were all arrested on the tarmac immediately. 2 of them were given the death penalty. Many of you heard Yosef Mendelevich here a few years ago speak about, he was one of the participants of the Leningrad trials, which were notorious. But these 2 trials sparked a movement on 2 sides of the ocean. The Jews in the Soviet Union who could read between the lines understood that these people were doing something because they wanted to leave for Israel and couldn't. And Jews across the country, across these 11 time zones, started little by little to apply to leave the country. And of course, they were refused. But we in the West, these Leningrad trials also sparked a movement in the West. We heard about it on television. It was John Chancellor who reported it. And Letty and I heard the news, and I said to myself, what is this? Jews aren't hijackers. There's more to the story. But in places like Rome and New York, Jews took to the streets and started to demonstrate because they knew that these Jews were being arrested because they were Jews and were not allowed to leave the country. So the grassroots movement in the United States was born because of the Leningrad trials. And Jews in the Soviet Union at the same time, even though we were divided by this massive iron curtain, and in those days, you understand, there were no telephone calls. They refused, people in the Soviet Union had phones, but they were all bugged by KGB. And if an American called them, they were immediately under additional scrutiny. If you sent a letter from the United States to somebody in the Soviet Union, KGB had censors and the mails. They knew every letter that went through. They were opened at the border. So everybody, especially Jews, were under tremendous scrutiny. So we had this wall. cutting off this iron curtain. But for us, for Jews, we really felt that iron. And how were we going to penetrate this iron curtain to find out what was happening in the Soviet Union and to find out what Jews wanted us to do? Little by little, these Jews from the Soviet Union, but I mean, you're talking about, we knew at that time 3 to 5 million Jews that were in the Soviet Union. If I'm telling you 10, 15 Jews were able to leave and maybe 19 in the early 70s, but they came to Israel and they gave information. Who was there, who was their families, who they left behind, when they applied, when they were refused, who was in prison because of what kind of a pretext that they were arrested on. And they sent us the information. And with that information, which we then were able to use to reach out to Soviet Jews themselves from America, we started things like, we were informed that the best thing that we could do to help Jews in the Soviet Union who wanted to leave, who had applied to leave, and who wanted publicity was to give them publicity, to write them, to send them visitors, to be in contact with them. It wasn't general. You couldn't just travel to the Soviet Union and say, as my Marilyn Thomas would say, Zubista Yid. You couldn't say that was Yiddish for are you a Jew? You couldn't just say that. You had to have a specific person because you needed his permission to be able to contact him, because it could either help him, but it also would put him in a certain jeopardy. So we reached out to Soviet Jews and we started doing things like postal campaigns. And as Susie can tell you, we took how we did it was we got a refusnik name and a family, and we documented everything very carefully. And we gave that case to a synagogue, to this synagogue. We did it in Illinois at Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry, and we did it across the country. By 1978, by the time I became the national president, we had 43 councils across America. And each of us were doing the same thing. We were adopting Soviet Jews. We were using those adoptions to put pressure on our congressmen. After all, if you were to take how many synagogues are in the North Shore right now? Yes, 7, 8, 10. Now, what? All right, 25 maybe? 25 synagogues. Now, each of you have got 25 Soviet Jews, and you've got 25 synagogues writing to your senator. Please make sure that the White House raises this case at the next time that there's a summit. And you've got 25 synagogues hitting your 2 senators and your congressman. All of a sudden, you've got a Congress, which we had, which was a very strong supporter for Soviet Jewry. We had congressional support for Soviet Jewry. We had a congressional Helsinki committee for Soviet Jewry. The Congress and the Senate were basically an extension of the Union of Councils for Soviet Jewry. There was nothing that they would do. And the interesting thing is it crossed both sides of the aisle. It unified. It was a unifying theme, and they worked together, and they passed a very important legislation in 1974, which tied immigration to trade, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. So we also, because we were able to get the Congress, we were also be able to have a influence at the State Department level. There was an Undersecretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs who worked on the cases of Soviet Jewries and raised the cases. Ambassador Shifter, may he rest in peace. We had all the administrations were working very hard. In fact, our current president, when he was in Boston, Delaware, he also was working for Soviet Jewry. So at that time, we had Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry, which was extremely active. And I know that there are a number of you very big supporters of Chicago Action. And we were, you know, grassroots and dependent on volunteers and on our private donations. And for that, we really, really are grateful. Still today. Now, I want to tell you what it was like for the Jews in the Soviet Union while we were doing all this. If you decided you're a family of, say, 4, and you decide you are going to apply for permission, and you're both working, you have to take this application, if you could get it. First of all, first thing you needed an invitation from the state of Israel. A family member, someone from the state of Israel. So it meant that you needed to know the movement, the activists of the movement, to get word out to us, for example, and we could get all the information on your family, which, and I mean, if the spelling was wrong of your name or a birth date was wrong, the Soviets would invalidate the application. Everything had to be perfect. And we're talking Moscow, Chicago, or Vladivostok, Chicago, or Khmelnytsky, Chicago. You know, you used to pick a phone and say, well, can I check the spelling of your name? So we would send the information to Israel. Israel would send an invitation to Khmelnytsky, to this family in Khmelnytsky. But it has to go by hand. It had to go by mail, and it had to be post stamped. Now, what happened when the Soviet censors saw this letter postmarked? It had to be postmarked from Israel. It was an immediate notification to the secret police, the KGB, that family was a Zionist family who wanted to go to Israel, and they were under scrutiny. So now they have this piece of paper, and they take it to the OVIR office, the application office, and they apply, and they will give you a piece of paper that you have to take to your work. Now, maybe you work maybe you're very, very fortunate and you have the ability to work, as many people did, in scientific institutions. Now, you have to take it to your immediate supervisor, and you have to sign off on it. You know what that meant? You know what they did? All of a sudden, your colleagues were called to a meeting like this, and they stood you up, and they humiliated you, calling you horrible anti-Semitic names, took away all your degrees, fired you from your job. You were no longer working. You no longer, and this happened to both men and women, whoever was working. The kids had to take that piece of paper to the schools, and they were thrown out of their schools. Now, these are families with no income. And they're now pariahs. They no longer have a place to work. And they have to take this piece of paper to their apartment buildings, and they have to show it to the manager. And everybody in the apartment knows that they are an anti-Soviet spy, conspirator, whatever they wanted to call them. And there were movies made about them. There was, on Leningradskaya television, there were movies made on state TV which showed smugglers who were smuggling information into the Soviet Union, anti-Soviet, and shown on television. See, you're 15 years old, you see your father's picture as an anti-Soviet agitator. This is what it was like for people in the Soviet Union. And yet, why I call them hidden heroes. In spite of everything, they realized the first thing they realized was that they were no longer Homo Sovieticus. They were no longer Soviet man. They were no longer Soviet. Who am I? What am I? And they began to think, what does it mean to be a Jew? what does it mean to be Israel? What does it mean Hebrew? What does it mean? And they began, people started teaching themselves as early as the early 70s, how from somebody that, an old man at a shul, which were all, by the way, government control. The Choral Synagogue was run by a rabbi who was given permission by the KGB and trained in Romania, absolute KGB. People didn't even go into the shul. The activists, they stayed outside. And they began teaching themselves Hebrew. Aleph Bet, Natan Sharansky's wife, called it Aleph Melim. How many words? 1,000 words. How many words you know? Not sentences. That was already, how many words in Hebrew do you know? And they began to study Hebrew. And then they began to teach it. Now, Hebrew was an unofficial language and you couldn't get permission to teach Hebrew. So it became suspect. So you were teaching basically underground. People were coming to apartments. I'm telling you, apartments like, if you could see Yevgeny or Grigory Wasserman's apartment, where there are people like this meeting in an apartment and they're learning Judaism, they're learning Hebrew, they're learning whatever they're learning. And all of a sudden there's a knocks on the door and you see armed militias and they're taking the names of every single person that's there. And one of them, Yevgeny Lane, they took him and they grabbed him and they arrested him. And they said that he struck a police officer. He spent 3 years in hard labor camp in Siberia, teaching and learning Hebrew. This was life in the Soviet Union. And yet, I want to tell you what I saw. I saw people that I have yet to meet anybody outside really the Soviet Union with the stature and the moral courage of people who were refuseniks. There was no one that I met or didn't meet that didn't have a lasting impression of, because they lived their life with courage, with truth. Who am I? What does it mean to be a Jew? Even if I'm not liked, even if my friends won't. Alex Salichanik was a prisoner in Leningrad, 3 years. He got for his application for immigration. He told a story in the movie Refusnik, which was, you could rent. He told a story of how his friends tried to bury him alive as a kid, calling him Yid, 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 Jid, Jid, Jid. And yet they said, they didn't hide their Jewishness. They decided, what does it mean to be a Jew? And they began to express it. Elena Kelbert, you'll read about these people. This is Elena Kelbert wrote a play on Masada. And they actors and young people would gather, especially before Purim, in apartments and act out the play Masada. There were, Grigory Wasserman was teaching Talmud and Torah and wearing a kippah on the streets in Leningrad. And of course, KGB came and knocked him down. But Joseph Mendelevich in prison, when they told him, you'll remember the story, when you heard that he said in prison, he didn't have a kippah. So he ripped some of his clothes and he put a shmati, a piece of rag on his head. And the prison guard said, what are you doing? He said, I'm a Jew. I have to keep my head covered. I'm a Jew. Or he chiseled, he chiseled with a nail Shabbos candles on a wall because in prison, and then on bless the wall, and to make a bracha for Shabbos. And I'm in Deerfield. And I'm telling you honestly, I mean, you introduced me, so this is the part of the story. I'm in Deerfield. They were celebrating Simchas Torah. Did I know what Simchas Torah was? When Ari Volvovsky told me, my husband and I, to send him, and he was exiled to Gorky. He was an underground Hebrew teacher that my husband and I met on our first trip to Moscow in 78. And he asked me for a book on kashrut, and I'm in Deerfield. He's like, Harry Volvovsky's going to keep kosher in Gorky? And there's no meat, and there's nothing, and I'm not going to keep a kosher home in Deerfield? I mean, nothing made sense to me. And as my husband and I moved along this circuit and met people, and I've traveled many times to the Soviet Union, and I traveled to Israel where people were immigrating from the Soviet Union. We brought them to Chicago, and we had them speak of Solel and at every single Bethel, and we did everything to try to raise public consciousness. But every single time I met somebody, they left a seed in me. And I wrote the book because I feel like these people are heroes, and they have messages, a message for American Jews, especially for our young people, because when I was, the first time I was in Moscow, I remember looking around. Every time since then, I would look around and be sitting in a room with people. They looked exactly like my aunt and uncle. I mean, it was the same face. I mean, they were mine. It was my family. The only difference was that my grandparents left and they didn't. So we met refuseniks who had the moral core courage to choose to be Jewish under a government that hated them, to explore what it meant to be a Jew, to choose to protest their refusals and to struggle against the anti-Zionism, to go to a Jewish homeland that the Soviets propagandize as anti-Soviets. They had the courage to teach in underground seminars and to learn. And they had the courage to defy social norms. And not only, it wasn't so, Irina Gildenborn came to, we brought her once to Chicago. And she told me about what it meant to demonstrate. There was groups. They had various groups of people that were that tried to get the Soviets to agree to let them leave. And even though it was illegal and they could be arrested, they would go on demonstrations anyway. What does a demonstration mean in the Soviet Union? It meant that you took something like a letter, like each one would decide what letter, let my people go, and there would be maybe 6 or 7 people with letters, and hide it under your coat. And then you would go in, each woman, and this is the women's movement demonstration I'm thinking, would go into a subway in different places. And at exactly the same time, they would meet on Leningradskaya Ulitsa on the street. And in 1 minute, they would open their shirt and said, let my people go. And within 15 seconds, they were arrested. KGB knew but they did it. And they didn't stop doing it. And finally, I'm taking you too far to the end of the story. But this was a very long process. This process took of my adult life. It took really 30 years from 1970 until 1996 for the gates to really open. And when I look back when I finished writing the book, I had this incredible, I don't know, like what I think is a revelation. And I thought of our history, and I thought of what I have learned, and many of you have learned time and time. Why were we exiled from the temple? Our disunity. We were disunified. We were sent into gullahs, into exile, because we weren't unified. We spoke about each other. We tore each other apart. We criticized each other. We spoke Lashon Hara. And we've spent 2,000 years in this exile that we're still in. And when the Kremlin came down, it was after when you started to realize that almost 2 million Jews left the Soviet Union. I honestly didn't realize this until after I was almost like on the end of the book. I was like aghast because I had this actual realization that this was miraculous. This wasn't the result of a political movement. This was the result of Jews being together. This was the result of unity. And just like God sent us into galut, into exile because of our disunion, this union, this love that the grassroots movement, the Union of Councils, Chicago Action had for the Lev Blichsteins and the Yevgeny Lanes and the Lena Stonovs and all the individual people that really, we loved them like they were Lvovsky, like they were our family. It really, I believe, brought about this tremendous exodus from the Soviet Union. And I think, in fact, brought down the Kremlin. And I really believe that it was a miracle. And I'm grateful that you all came, and I'm happy to entertain any questions that you might have. And I really hope you'll read the book. I tried to write it like Daniel Silva would write it, like a spy novel. I don't know if it worked or not, but I really wanted it to be a page turner. A couple of people have said it's a page turner. My great thing is that I had 4 grown men tell me they cried. So that made me feel really good. And I hope you'll read them, and I hope you'll remember the names and remember the stories, because we have heroes in our lifetime. And it's such a tragedy that their names are not known and that they're not known. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to. I never thought that. Honestly, I never thought that. I'll tell you, for me, I grew up at a time when it was like in the 60s and the late 50s, and the stories of the Holocaust just came out. And I couldn't understand, and I was like 17, 18 years old. I could not understand how American Jews let 1 million children go up the smoke streets. Even at 17, I don't know why I thought, okay, I expected for Europe, but American Jews allowed 1 million in freedom. I could not, I couldn't I couldn't understand it. And something, when I heard Dr. Stern was arrested in Russia, and when I heard about the Leningrad trials, something inside me, it was like a visceral scream. No, not on my watch. And it wasn't something that I thought I was going to, it wasn't like a global vision of what I was going to do. I had 3 little kids, and I hate public speaking, and I really had no experience in organizational life. I'm a literature major. Thank God I had Marilyn Tallman to help me, because I didn't know, I didn't have money or access to money to build a public organization at Highland Park. And thank God for my husband who rented the office. And it was just one step at a time. And just, I think I'm really giving you my inner kishkes tonight. But at some point I really realized, and we were not observant. We were just regular identified Jews. But at some point I realized that what was happening to me was not normal. That there were things that were happening, that when I needed something, and Marilyn, my partner, Marilyn Tallman, may she rest in peace, who really was a tzedekah and a real hero. I mean, she wasn't hidden, but she was a real hero. she was the one who first brought it to my attention that whatever we needed, somehow it happened. I remember one time, Tanya Zunshine's sister needed a heart valve because Jews couldn't get treated by that. It couldn't get treated, but the medical system, and she was in Riga, told her if she could get a heart valve, they would operate on her. Where was I getting a heart back? I put down the phone and Marilyn Tallman walks in the room. She says, "You won't believe it. I just got a telephone call from this doctor. He says, if you ever need a heart valve, you call me." I'm telling you, it happened. It happened all the time. One of my favorites, all the time. One of my stories is that Yakov Mesh was beaten up. He was a prisoner. He wanted to meet Nixon in 75 in Moscow, and they pulled him off the train and they arrested him and they put him in prison in Odessa, and then they threw him out of the prison because they had beaten him so much. And Natasha, an activist in Moscow, they never called. They couldn't make a phone call out. It was impossible. They called. I was in the Deerfield house. He called at 4 o'clock, and she says to me, "Oh, this is they needed bear fat. You get us bear fat?" Where are you going to get bear fat? I never even heard of bear fat. I went to the office. Marilyn reminds me we've got a group in Anchorage, Alaska. We call the guy in Anchorage, Alaska. Just so happens, this is what I mean. He has a tourist going from Anchorage, Alaska, over the straits to Vladivostok in Moscow. And there happens to be someone leaving from Vladivostok on a train to Moscow, like 7 time zones away. And they got the bear fat within something like 3 days. So they thought, the refusers thought there was nothing we couldn't do. Just, we can get to live bear fat to Moscow. So to answer your question, there was no global vision. No one, it was a question of what was the next thing on our agenda. If somebody got permission to leave, we had a quick l'chaim, and then our vision was back in the Soviet Union on the next person we had to get out. And it wasn't, when it all happened, it was a shock. No one expected it to happen. No one expected they would bring down the statue of Dzerzhinsky, or that the Soviet Union would come down, or that 2 million Jews would. It was just, at the time, it was inconceivable. When there was I think 1983, we had 83 people left the Soviet Union, and every single one of them was part of someone who was in I had contacts in the Soviet Union that I worked with. And it was part of this Gorodetsky Chicago network that they threw them out. But 83 people, that was it. Then you see 2 million people left. It was miraculous. Correct. Correct. They ultimately. Right. Correct.
Christmas, if they had something to eat, because they, yeah.
Did you go from, were you from London? Oh, from San Diego. We had a council in San Diego.
I know.
Thank you. Thank you. You're absolutely right. Thank you. What? Oh, I can talk about that a little bit.
You trained us.
We yes, we did. If you were going to, we looked for people to go to Russia. We did. They weren't just accidental tourists. We looked for people to go, and then in many cases we sent them. We literally paid for them to go because they needed Hebrew teachers, they needed doctors, they needed all professionals. They needed activists, they needed writers, they needed whatever you were, they needed you. And we spent as much as 17 hours briefing people. To go to Russia, if you were going and you were a serious, tourist, you needed to be able to read Cyrillic. You had to be able to read a map. You had to know exactly how to negotiate in the cities you were in. I gave you cases, like 5-7 cases in each city, and you knew how to know those cases and what they needed physically and the questions that we needed to know, and you could write nothing down. Everything had to be memorized. And then we had a way. Tell me your name. Harriet? Marilyn. Talked about the prisoners and what prisoners there. We were told there were various people in Moscow, especially Natasha Hasna, Lev Lichtin, who before that Dina Balino, who were in charge. Ina Nudel, big hidden hero, you should know that name. Who was in charge of the prisoners, the Jews that were sent to prison. And she knew what they needed and how to get things into the camp and how to disguise what they had. So you're right. White chocolate, we could disguise as soap. They could get candy, so we gave them children's vitamins, the Chewies, long underwear, tea. There were all kinds of things. Now we also sent in. We also sent in hard goods for them to sell, because as I was telling you, people were fired from the jobs. So the movement was, there were people that hadn't worked in. Yuli Kasharovsky didn't work in for 17 years. So every tourist got, for us, and I want to tell you what this was like for people like us at Chicago Action. Every person got a Nikon camera, which Hetty DeLuey, another hidden hero in our office, bought. I think at the time they were $500. So we were sending, and we bought them. Everyone got a Nikon camera. Everybody got film. Everybody got tape recorders for the Hebrew teachers. And we taught you how to go through customs. But what we didn't, what now is in the book, which, you know, we never would have ever talked about any of this stuff publicly before. And that is Betty Kahn, who worked in our office. We were all volunteers, by the way. Betty Kahn devised a system. She was a photographer. She brought all these special lights, and she photographed documents. In other words, documents that our policy, union of councils, position papers, policies, letters from the president, general statements from the Congress, all kinds of things that refuseniks needed to know. And she photographed them. And Hetty, they took the undeveloped film and rewound it back in the little canisters. And Hetty then took it back and had them shrink wrapped. So you would go into Russia with, you know, the most important materials that you could have possibly gotten in. And you went to a safe house, somebody who knew you were coming, and they took the film and distributed the film to who could process it, and distributed the prisoners group to, we sent that to the person who was in charge of prisoners. Everything went to the Hebrew teachers. Everybody got what they needed. And we only had, I'll tell you, we sent, in the years that we were working, and we were at Chicago Action we moved to the office in 1978 to the time it closed, it was at 96. We had one case of somebody who got into trouble, and that wasn't because of something he brought in. That was because he didn't do what he was told. Everybody was told exactly what to do. And there's some really funny stories of people, Harvey Barnett and Gary Gervery, if you know them. There are some really funny stories in the book about people who, you know, were picked up and how cleverly they handled the KGB because they did what they were told to do. The stuff coming out. People just took them out. People took them out. And we got a tremendous amount of information out. And Jews just took them out. We figured, what are they going to do? We were operating with absolute assurance at the time. It might have been a little gutsy in retrospect, but we really felt that the Soviet Union was not going to arrest somebody from the United States because they brought something up. They just weren't going to do it. They'd take it away. They might scare you. The worst thing they did, the worst thing they did was our congressman, John Porter from the 10th district. He went in 1978, and they really wanted to put him through the grill, and on the way out, his wife was strip searched, which was, in a way, great for us because he made a great advocate, you know, in the Congress. Great advocate.
Class, I think, or meeting with Marilyn.
But I can.
Yeah, I was in a class for reading with Marilyn. And she said, we're sending people over. Give me your watches now. Give me your watches. Give me your watches. Unfortunately, I couldn't afford what kind of watch I would have now, but I would have given it. But I mean,
yes.
We also got watches off and gave it to them.
Yes.
She said, these people they need to trade.
Yes. You know what Marilyn used to say when people would show that they were nervous? You know, especially if you went to Kiev in those years, you got a KGB briefing. We told you Marilyn would play at what to do in case, you know, you were picked up. And she would, you know, put you through a little drama. And if they showed any kind of hesitancy, Marilyn would always say, will you stop worrying? If anything happens to you, we can always get another tourist. That was Marilyn. Yeah. It was, you know, if anybody was caught, that was the most dangerous. And we never used, I mean, at the end, we were able to figure out ways to do it, but we were very careful with money because the Soviets imprisoned people on these spurious charges. And that with you know, with corruption, and we didn't touch that. Although I have to say that I have spoken many times in many different places, and I have always said, thinking about one couple in Highland Park who was working in our office, and I always said, and still say, that if I could have bought Yevgeny Lane out, I know I could have gone to this couple and they would have put a second mortgage on their house without a question. And I could probably say that for about a dozen people. That was what the commitment was. It was like a part of you was missing, and you couldn't be whole until that person, and especially those people who went to the Soviet Union and met people there, they came back. You know, I've had so many people say to me that the 2 weeks or the 10 days or the 5 days they spent in the Soviet Union were the most definitive days, or weeks, time of their life. And they made contacts that, I mean, Harvey Barnett, one of the people who you read about, many of you know him, his granddaughter was just in Israel meeting the granddaughter of a refusenik that he went to see. I mean, this goes for generations. These were connections that were very, very deep. So, stand strong and stand proud. I see, look, I, you know, in a way, I'm reliving this battle every day with this book. And I see what's happening on the college campuses. And I've had people tell me over the last 5 or 6 years, it's an exaggeration, don't worry, it's always been this way. This is a phenomenon in America. And the kids are afraid. I just talked to someone who was a Hillel director at Indiana University, and I just did a Zoom with Minnesota University students. Kids are afraid. Jews are afraid to stand up. Jewish students in American universities are afraid to stand up. And that, to me, is what they went through in communism. And it scares me. And I was one of the reasons that I said at the beginning of this tonight that people, parents told their kids in Russia, be quiet, don't make waves. I don't know what parents are telling their kids today, but they've got to stand up and be strong, and they've got to fight this. It's a matter of dignity, and it's a matter of strength. It's also a question of, the other thing is not only stand tall and be proud of who you are, is know who you are and have the dignity of knowing who you are and what you come from, and not to be intimidated by the social group. Sharansky has a book out called, his newest book is called Never Alone. And he writes about what it was like growing up in, I forgot where the town he was from. But he talks about the conformity, the need to conform. And that conformity was typical of Russia and typical of the Soviet Union. Conform. That's what I see today in the college campuses with Jews. Conform. Don't make waves. Don't stand up. And it's very, 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 very frightening for me. I think that's the battle. I personally think that's part of the battle today.
One stick. And you know what?
Yeah. Right. But now I'll tell you, that's, I think the Students for Safe, Citizens Supporting Israel, they're and stand with us. And there are a lot of, even the there's a rabbi at the Hillel at IU that's really working on the anti-Semitism. There are organizations that are, that are helping kids, and in most cases, it isn't physical, it's intimidation, and it's wanting to be accepted. It's the social pressure at this point. I don't know what it'll be tomorrow. I hope that answers your question. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Have a good night. Oh, we might have a question. Good night, everyone. Thank you.